We need someone to keep time.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Lobat Sadrehashemi. Lobat? Lobat is a refugee and immigration lawyer practicing in Vancouver. She has argued at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. Lobat has testified a number of times at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. She has written numerous articles and reports on refugee and human rights issues, including a report funded by Law Foundation BC, Refugee Reform and Access to Counsel in British Columbia, that examine how changes to the refugee system have had serious consequences for refugee claimants. Lobat also authored Conditional Permanent Residency, The Dangers of Making Immigration Status Conditional on Living with a Spouse. Lobat graduated from the University of Toronto, joined Law and Social Work program. She spent the first years of practice at the legal nonprofit Pivot Legal Society. She also has worked at the BC Public Interest Advocacy Center, focusing on systemic human rights issues facing low-income people. Lobat is past president of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers and on the legal committee for West Coast Leave. So welcome, Lobat. Thank you for being here. I always told Lobat that if I needed a lawyer, I wish she could be my lawyer because she has been very supportive with many cases that we have with women with precarious immigration status. So I'm so happy that she's here. So our next guest is Alejandra Lopez. She was born and raised in Mexico City, and Vancouver has been her home since 2006. She's passionate about facilitating safe spaces for inclusive dialogue using art and storytelling, and as an emancipating way for communicating and healing. She has worked in neighborhood houses, community centers, different community organizations in Vancouver and Mexico, as well as organized with grassroots groups. She currently works with the Vancouver Foundation on an initiative called Level that aims to address racial inequality in the nonprofit and charitable sector by creating leadership opportunities for indigenous and racialized immigrant and refugee youth. Previously, she managed the Fresh Voices initiative, working with immigrant and refugee youth to influence policy and systems in BC. She organized the Sanctuary Health to advocate with and provide access to service without fear of deportation for people with precarious and no immigration status. Her involvement with immigrant communities is connected to her personal journey of redefining identity and belonging, as well as to commitment to address sexism, white supremacy, and colonization. Welcome, Alejandra. So Ingrid, yours is long. Can I go half? Yeah. Okay. So Ingrid Mendez is a Guatemalan woman that came to Canada as political refugee 26 years ago. Immediately after arriving, she engaged in supporting and organizing with immigrant refugee communities and low-income families. She built a home here in Vancouver, raising a family with the values of generosity, love, social justice, and solidarity. Ingrid volunteered from the moment she arrived and continues to do so to make Vancouver an inclusive city for all, supporting newcomer families, as well advocating to keep the downtown east side a place where families are welcome and safe. Ingrid has worked from a harm reduction approach with people experiencing drug and alcohol misuse. She built relationships with the Guatemalan community in exile in Vancouver, as well as other immigrant communities working towards being connected and engaged on social and political issues in their native countries, as well as addressing the challenges of being a newcomer in Canada. Nurturing and caring for people is a way of being in Ingrid and her family life. She is the frontline cooking delicious, heartwarming Latin American meals for children and families. Ingrid has been for several years the coordinator and substance use misuse counselor for Latin American program at Watari, a community agency that supports street-involved youth and families in the downtown east side. She actively reaches out to the Latin American community and creates spaces for learning, healing, nurturing, growing, and belonging. The participants in these programs and services engage in sharing skills, playing music from their homeland, cooking for each other, their traditional food, growing and harvesting food, and the communal garden and sharing with each other. Ingrid is a strong advocate to raise the voice of marginalized immigrant and refugee communities by organizing events, attending rallies, sitting around the kitchen table, and mostly giving one-on-one emotional, physical, social, and mental support to anyone who needs it. So welcome, Ingrid. Thanks for being here. And Chris, I don't have her bio, but Chris has been a long way fighter, and she has affect change for LGBTQ two-spirit communities. And I just want to highlight, as an immigrant and also working with people with precarious immigration status, Chris was one of the first people who acknowledged the struggles for many people who are in this country for all the reasons that we are going to discuss and that don't have a status and don't have access to services. So welcome, Chris, and thank you for accepting to be here. And she's the executive director of Rainbow Refugee. Thank you. So we are going to talk about immigration, a colonial system that we are trying to change. We want to recognize that it's a system that is colonial, sexist, classist, is homophobic, right? And that all those factors are going to be barriers for people to enter into Canada. So we are going to navigate through those barriers, but also how everybody here are fighters, are activists, so we are breaking those barriers slowly, and it's ongoing work, but we have been able to break some of those barriers. So thank you, Lobat, for being here, and I give you the microphone. Oh, she has one.
No. Oh, yeah, it works already. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'm really glad to be here. When Prime Minister Trudeau was announcing the conference this week, the Women Deliver conference, he said, prioritizing the health, rights, and well-being of girls and women is not optional, but in fact foundational to drive change and progress for all, and this is reflected in our new feminist foreign policy. And yet, this government ignores the impact of the United States' decision to abandon women who are fleeing domestic violence from refugee protection. So there's lots we can talk about, but I want to spend my time talking about the impact of the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States on women, and also I want to talk about something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and that's our government's decision to stick major changes to our refugee determination system in the federal budget bill. So, as many of you know, Canada has an agreement with the United States called the Safe Third Country Agreement. And basically that agreement presumes that our refugee determination systems are comparable, like that they are similar or alike. So if somebody comes to a land border and says, I want to make a refugee claim in Canada, and they've come from the United States, Canada will not process their claim. Most likely, in most cases, Canada will not process their claim on the presumption that the US will fairly determine their claim. And I don't have time now to go through all of the evidence about all the deficiencies and the abuse and arbitrariness and unfairness in the US asylum system. Actually, the constitutionality of that agreement is being challenged by the Canadian Council of Churches, Canadian Council of Refugees, and Amnesty International. And I won't get into all of those arguments. But for today, I wanted to focus on the impact of the US policy for women who are fleeing domestic violence. So in 2018, then U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions established a binding legal precedent. So he made a ruling that was binding on all other decision makers that ruled that women cannot get refugee protection from gender persecution based on domestic violence, even where the woman comes from a country where there's no state protection from domestic violence. So, for example, take Honduras. Anybody who's read any human rights report about Honduras knows that the police do not protect women from domestic violence, and it has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. So it is about life and death. And if a woman somehow gets out and makes it through great difficulty to the United States and makes a refugee claim saying, I can't get protection from the violence that I face, the police will not help me in my country, it's very likely that she will not get protection in the United States. Her claim will be denied because of this ruling that finds you should be able, you don't get protection because it's not the state that is the one that's harming you, but an individual. And that's out of line with international law, and it's completely out of line with the way Canada treats a similar refugee claim. Canada has long recognized refugee claims based on domestic violence. And yet, if this woman comes up to a land border to Canada to make a refugee claim, we would send her back to the United States, where she will most likely be detained, and her refugee claim will most likely be denied. That's what we do every day in Canada. And now, in April, the government has taken further steps to completely ignore the reality in the United States. In April, they introduced these major changes to the refugee determination system in a budget bill. So basically, there's no time to really, for the public to really understand the significance of the changes, but they are significant. So what they've done is they've said there's a new class of ineligibility. So there's this whole new group of people who are now going to be ineligible for refugee protection, which means they won't get a full hearing before an independent tribunal, the Immigration Refugee Board. That's where almost everyone goes to have their hearing heard. And so what the provision says is it says, if you've made a claim in a country that Canada happens to have an information sharing agreement with, US is one of those countries, also UK, New Zealand, Australia. If you've already made a claim there, it doesn't have to have been decided. If you've just made the claim in one of those countries, and then you get to Canada, you don't get to have a hearing before the Immigration Refugee Board. Instead, you will get a process that is primarily a written process with a government official, not an independent tribunal member. You won't have a court-like process. You won't get an appeal. You won't have protection from protection from removal while you're challenging the legality of the decision. So there's a lot of things that this new class of claimant loses. That there's fundamental rights that they don't have. Minister Blair and others in the government have said, don't worry, no one's going to be deported without having their claims heard. But as I've said, the claims aren't going to be heard by an independent tribunal. They'll be heard, they will have a chance to make their claim, but it will be with a government official in a primarily written process. So what we're doing with these amendments, to take it back to the example of a woman who is fleeing domestic violence, we're punishing a woman whose claim was based on domestic violence, that claim was either rejected in the US, or maybe she abandoned her claim in the US because she got good advice that it was likely to be rejected. That we would punish these women and their children with an inferior process and tell them they're not deserving of a full hearing before the Immigration Refugee Board. And it's particularly troubling because these are exactly the kinds of cases that we know need more procedural protections. And the government has also said this is about asylum shopping. But these refugee claimants are not shopping. They are actually trying to seek safety and protection, and against great odds. And what we're doing with the Safe Third Country Agreement and the amendments in this bill are making it harder for them to get safety. So 46 women's groups, many of them who are here today, signed on to an open letter to the Prime Minister asking him to reject these amendments to the refugee determination process in the budget bill. The bill has not yet passed. It is with the Senate. And just recently, Minister Blair was there testifying and was directly asked, and I think it was thanks to these groups that have spoken out, asked directly about the impact on women. He just offered the same thing that, we won't deport people, we'll find a way to get them protection, not acknowledging that we've offered them a less fair process, and there's no reason for them to have a less fair process. I'll just conclude now and just say that a feminist government would suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, and there's no way that a feminist government would put in these kinds of amendments to the refugee determination system in a budget bill. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Lobat. And thank you, Rosa, for having us here. I want to introduce myself in Spanish. Me llamo Alejandra Lopez y llegué aquí hace 12 años y vivo ahora en el territorio nunca antes cedido de Tsleil-Waututh-Musqueam-Squamish, y es un privilegio para mí aprender y crecer y hacer el trabajo que hago, también en solidaridad con las naciones indígenas. So, I've been trying to do this practice, to do the land acknowledgement in my language as a way to continue to learn on how to do the work we do about migrant justice, but also trying to understand and be in solidarity with indigenous people, and this just is one way to continue to learn to do this. And Ingrid and I are going to present together, so I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to pass the microphone to Ingrid to start. We want to give a little bit of context of why people are forced to migrate, and talk about our experiences and the stories that we listen to when we are supporting and organizing with families with precarious status and from people in our community. And then we're going to talk also about the organizing that community is doing to address these realities and to be able to support each other. So.
Buenos días. Buenos días. Hello, everyone. My name is Ingrid, as Rosa said. I come from Guatemala, from the traditional ancestral territories of the Mayan Quiche people, where I was privileged to be born, grow up, and being raised by a wonderful family. So we want to talk a little bit of why people leave our countries, and we have this exodus of people leaving right now from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and going through Mexico. By the way, the Guatemalan government just authorized this week the U.S. Army to come and settle their forces in the border between Guatemala and Mexico. So as of this week, the U.S. Army will be detaining people, including women and children, with authorization of the Guatemalan government. So why is it that people come to Canada? When we look back in history, as some of you might know, there was a war. In Guatemala, the war lasted for 35 years. And in El Salvador, there was also an internal war for many years. And in Honduras, there hasn't been an official war, but obviously there are the same issues that Guatemala and El Salvador and a lot of countries in Latin America have experienced. The south of Mexico has also had wars. And when we talk about these wars and we see the majority of people who were affected by them, we see that the majority were women. Women who were victims of sexual assault, sexual violence, women and children, and especially girls. And so we had thousands of widows, thousands of women who were killed, massacred, thousands of children who were killed and massacred by the armies, which were backed up by the United States government through the CIA. Defending some of the business that the U.S. had back then in the beginning of the war, and so trying to get the land of, especially ancestral land, for these businesses that U.S. had interest on. So after these wars, there was a peace accord signed, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador. The peace accord in Guatemala was supported by the Canadian government. And the Canadian government came and facilitated many of the talks between the army and the guerrilla in Guatemala. Little did we know that the Canadian government had their own interests for doing this. And we just didn't know what their interests were. And so after all the femicides and ethnocides and genocides that happened, and the peace accords were signed, we had the mining companies arrived as soon as there was no official war. And most of those mining companies were operated and owned by the Canadians and by the US. So now the situation is that Canadian minings are coming into the country, and we're not talking only here about Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, we're talking about Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, and a lot of countries in Latin America. In Honduras, for example, one of the Canadian mines discovered through their satellites that in one of the cemeteries, an ancestral cemetery in one of the territories, ancestral territory, indigenous territory, had gold underneath. So since 2 years ago, the protectors had been fighting against police that the Canadian mine has contracted to have this cemetery be empty by the community. And the community has been fighting against it. A lot of people have died, had been killed with bullets. A lot of people had been sent to jail and criminalized for defending their ancestors who are buried in this cemetery. So Canadian mining's mega projects and the organized crime was the next thing after the war. So we had a lot of this happening, and we have had a lot of this, and most of the people who are affected again are indigenous women, girls, and children, who now, because of what's going on and because of the threat against their lives, and because of being taken out of their territories and their land, now are looking to save themselves. So they come in exodus through Mexico, and they are trying to leave the sexual violence, they are trying to leave the kidnappings, they are trying to leave death, and they find death, kidnappings, and sexual violence on their way here. In Mexico, by organized crime again, police, corruption, and everything else that they find. So when they come here, these women, some of them, they don't speak English, they don't speak Spanish. Spanish is their second language. We have seen a lot of cases, especially with migrant workers, and a lot of you might have heard about the case of Golden Eagle Farm in Maple Ridge lately, where 170 women and men, but mostly women, were abused by the family who owns the Canucks, and who have a lot of land and a lot of property here. So these women, the stories we heard from them were many. But just last week I was hearing another story from one of the women and they were telling me that the driver of one of the buses who will come and pick them up from the place where they live and take them to where the cranberries and the blueberries are, this driver wanted to have a sexual relationship with this woman, and this woman kept saying, no, I don't want to. So one day when she was getting on the bus to go back to the house, or the house where they live, he just ran the bus. And she was trying to hold, and she fell, and he ran the bus, and he kind of dragged her with the bus. And I'm like, why didn't you tell us about this? And they're like, we are afraid. We have a lot of fear. They are told that if they say something, that they are going to be sent back to Guatemala, and that they are not going to come back next year to work in the farm. And these women have gone into huge bank loans to be able to come to Canada. These women have gone into doing, like, traveling from the town where they were born and raised to the city, and going into all of this to come to Canada. They also leave their whole family behind, and they are the only providers. So there's huge hopes for them to come to Canada and work in these farms, and none of this. They cannot do any of this because of the abuse that they are victims of. And so other cases that we have seen is women who have come here and being brought by their partners, who most of them are white and white Canadians, and they are told that if they come with them, they are gonna, this person is gonna have landed immigrant status for them. Once they come here, and some of them have gotten pregnant, and a lot of them have gotten pregnant, this partner says, well, I'm not interested in sponsoring you. And they now are victims of abuse. They get sexually abused, they get physical abuse and emotional abuse. And they are told that if they call immigration, they are gonna say that they came here with no support from this person that brought them here. So we had a case of a woman who was pregnant and started going into labor, and her partner said, you know, you cannot be screaming or crying because I have to go to work tomorrow. And this woman said, but I'm having the baby and I'm in huge pain. And he said, well, you better quiet because I need to sleep. And if you don't stop right now, I'm going to kick you out of the house. And she's like, but I cannot stop. You have no idea how bad this pain is. And he says, I don't care. I have to go back to sleep. And so because the labor continued, he kicked her out of the house. And so she went to a bus station, waited for a bus, went to the hospital and said, you know, I'm in labor, I need to stay here. And the hospital said, you know, we totally get it, but you're not ready yet. You cannot stay here. So she went back to the house, and this man said, no, you cannot come in because you're crying and you're not letting me sleep. And I need to get up early tomorrow morning and go to work. So she goes back to the hospital. The hospital finally lets her stay. Then she has her baby, and he comes to the hospital. He starts screaming at her and saying he's not gonna let her in the house anymore. She leaves the hospital, goes to the house. He kicks her out again and says, you cannot stay here because the baby is crying a lot, you're crying, I cannot sleep, I cannot do anything. And I already called immigration and told them that I cancel my sponsorship on you. So now she goes back to the social worker. The social worker helps her go into a transition home, In the transition home, she talks to the worker about what's going on in her life. The worker calls immigration and then calls legal aid. And immigration is saying, you know, she doesn't have status in the country. Her sponsorship has been canceled by her partner. She calls legal aid, the worker calls legal aid, and legal aid doesn't get enough information and doesn't give her legal aid. So when she comes to us, she doesn't have legal aid. She's basically crying the whole time because she doesn't know what to do. And we had to go and advocate for her to get legal aid. So she got legal aid. She's with a lawyer now, and this lawyer is helping her in trying to see how she can stay in Canada and be with her baby. Because the other part to this is that the family of this person in Mexico now is trying to kill her family there. So her brother was run by one of their vehicles just a week after she had her baby here. So she's in huge danger if she goes back to Mexico.
And can I add something? I want to add a little bit about, like, in that process where she went to a transition house, there's a lot of, like, service providers and also frontline workers that are incredibly committed. They are very well intentioned, but one of the reasons of why also she got rejected legal aid is because first the support worker called immigration, not really knowing the reality or the risk of calling immigration, and tried to help her to apply to legal aid, but didn't have the tools, the awareness, and also the information, enough information about her situation to advocate for her. And so part of, like, the hardship also of trying to regularize their status is that this woman go through a journey here with no network or support. Many times the service providers or frontline workers, even though they want to do good work, they sometimes make the situation worse. And then also there's a lot of fear and stigma and shame. We know that a lot of women, when we face violence, we internalize that it's our fault, and we feel guilt, and we are fearful, and we're embarrassed. And so when many of these women go to legal aid or go to ask for help, they don't necessarily share their whole story because it's already really painful, but also they are facing a lot of fear and shame.
But that's kind of the things that we have been told. Since we were girls and growing up, we've been told that if we wear a small skirt, like a short skirt, it's our fault if we were sexually assaulted on the street because we were wearing that clothing, or it's our fault because we had earrings or we had makeup, and we kind of made this happen because of how we were dressed that day. So it's not the fault of the system. We are told that it is our fault. So a lot of these women who come here come with that same frame of mind, and when they are here, they normalize it. They normalize everything that happens to them. This emotional, physical, sexual abuse is their fault now. They deserved it. Maybe I did something. Maybe he got angry because I said something. Maybe it's true, is the baby was crying too much and I couldn't make the baby stop, and that's why he got angry at me and he got angry at the baby. So everything now is normalized, and they cannot advocate for themselves as we wish them to. So Ale, I'm gonna give it to you.
I wanted to share other stories, but because we want to also focus about the amazing organizing that the communities that are affected are doing, I want to share a little bit about Ingrid and I are part of a collective called Sanctuary Health. There's another member back there, Omar, that I do want to acknowledge.
He's our executive director.
And he, look at you. And this collective, we got together in 2012. when the interim federal health program was cut for refugees, and we tried to advocate for the provincial government to step up and provide these services for refugees. But along the way, we were supporting a lot of people, not only refugee claimants, but people that were rejected, people that were in precarious status, farm workers, temporary workers, that were also not accessing health services. And we discussed how can we support all migrants, regardless of their immigration status, particularly people with precarious or no immigration status, because they are the ones that are not supported by settlement organizations and that usually don't have access to any services at all. They have to work under the table. And we started advocating for a movement that started in the US. It's called Sanctuary Cities, which is a local response to like unjust federal immigration laws. We know it's a local response. There needs to be people like Lobat and other people doing amazing work at a federal level and Cruz to change unjust immigration laws. But because people are facing no access to basic services, we needed to organize to push for cities and community organizations, neighborhood houses, and other government agencies to step up to the plate to recognize and normalize that there's not such thing as good or bad refugee. There's not such thing as refugees that are more deserving than others, that these are people in our communities that are either taking care of our children, cleaning our homes, contributing in so many different ways to our communities, and that they are our neighbors, our families, our friends, and that we needed to make a statement to ensure that these families were accessing services. And so since then, we've been pushing for a series of different changes to policy, but particularly to for organizations to embrace the principles of Sanctuary City, which are the principle of access to services for all, regardless of immigration status, and safe spaces where CBSA, the Canadian Border Service Agencies, are not welcome, where if you're a teacher, if you are a driver of TransLink, if you're a nurse, if you're a social worker, your responsibility is to provide those services and care and not to enforce a federal immigration law. And so we pushed for Sanctuary City in the city of Vancouver. We weren't very successful, even though we spent like about 2 years doing this, because their Sanctuary City is not meaningful. They didn't get the Vancouver Police Department to stop their collaboration with CBSA. And so we continue to talk about this because we want more people that keep pushing for accountability, not only of the local enforcement agency, but also accountability on CBSA. And then we also push for sanctuary schools, which is communities and families with no status having basic access to education for their kids. In New West, it was the first sanctuary schools policy. We still face a lot of challenges. In the Vancouver School Board, we've been able to register lots of kids that live in Vancouver with no status, but it has been because of the relationships that the community has and that we have with very specific staff. They haven't passed a policy. We are hoping that more school districts join these efforts to endorse a sanctuary schools policy, but we also hope that this happens at a provincial level as well. We are also advocating the MSP. You want to talk about the MSP?
So we're also advocating for the Ministry of Health to give babies who are born in Canada to these families with precarious or no immigration status to have their MSP coverage and to end the 3-month wait period that a lot of people, when they move to this province, they have to wait 3 months before they get access to healthcare. These babies also have that. Even though they are born here in BC and they are Canadian citizens, they have to wait 3 months for their health coverage for them to be eligible. So these babies are also punished because they are born to families who are here with precarious or no immigration status. We are also part of the conversations for the CHCs, which are the new health centers that the provincial government is trying to start here in Vancouver. It's going to be the first one, and Esther has more information if somebody wants to know more, because Esther is a part of the Umbrella Clinic, which is already a CHC not recognized by the provincial government, and which is also supporting people with precarious immigration status and migrant workers. So we're pushing for Umbrella Clinic to be recognized as one of the CHCs in this province as well. What else are we working on, Ale?
Yes, we'll pass it to Chris. There's questions, we're happy to.
Yeah, because I want to leave time for people.
It's okay.
Say more about yourself because
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to say is that in another life, I used to be a member of a religious congregation of women. In other words, many people say that I was a nun. And for 29 years of my adult life, I was. I came to be a feminist because there was a global experience of women from the global north going to the global south to talk about women's issues and feminism. And I happened at the time to be in the global south because I was working in Santiago, Chile during the dictatorship of Pinochet. And so one of the things that I learned in that time was that we all know already that there's a hierarchy of women. It's very clear to us, and it's something we've known for a long time. One of the things that I didn't know, and perhaps you don't know either, is that nuns and sex trade workers are on the bottom rung of the ladder. So we're both on the same rung of the ladder. Now, I'm no longer a nun, but I am a lesbian, and so I don't think that I've moved up the ladder very much, because one of the definitions is that by definition we are not accessible to men. And so that's what brought me to my understanding of feminism, and that's to some extent what colors my own experience. There's one other thing by way of introduction that I want to say, and that is that yesterday the report on the genocide as a result of what has been happening, and continues to happen to Aboriginal women and children was released, and has been identified by many people as genocide. I want to acknowledge, before I can talk about immigration and refugees, I want to acknowledge that I am an immigrant to this country. I came with my parents when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And so the other piece of that I struggle with is that I was born in England, and therefore I am also part of the history that colonized Canada. And I struggle. I've been struggling the last couple of days with the conversations and the radio conversations around what Canada has done to our Aboriginal, our First Nations people. And so as someone who works in the field as a volunteer of immigration and refugees, one of the things that we take seriously is that as we assist new people to come to Canada, it's also incumbent on us to actually help those people to see and to understand the full Canadian history that includes this practice of genocide on the part of Canadian governments. So I struggle with what I do, and at the same time, I recognize that that the persecution of women and gay men, which is also rooted in misogyny, is global. It's not just a reality that we experience here in Canada, that it is global, and it is part of colonization, whether it was the British colonizing, whether it was the French or the Portuguese. all of the colonizers brought with them their attitudes towards women and also their attitudes towards people of, who we now identify as members of the LGBT community. So those are things by way of kind of trying to ground what we do also in the reality that we live. And so I don't know about others, but I struggle, and I think struggle is good, because when we struggle, we're challenged to question ourselves and question our own actions, and to see what our practice is that participates in and enables our government and other governments around the world to continue with the misogyny and the violence against women and other people who do not fit into the binary model of male and female. So that's by way of introduction. And I am a board member and a founder of Rainbow Refugee. And when Rainbow Refugee began in 2000, I always joke saying that in the beginning, our very first drop-ins that supported people who got here somehow or other under whatever visas or non-visas that they managed to get here, we started having these monthly drop-ins. And what was very clear to us was that we were 3 white women in a room full of men of color. And it kind of highlights for me that many of us as women, and I also believe there are men who get this, it's those of us that have these understandings and these visions that in fact are in a position to influence policy and policy changes. And the other piece of that is the other side of the coin, where it's also clear that the challenges for women in the global reality, the challenges for women are very difficult and in many ways different from the challenges of the gay men that we see. Women certainly most women do not qualify for Canada's skilled worker program. Women who come because of their being sponsored by a male partner we've just heard a story of how that has had an impact on the lives of immigrant women who come here. And I'm going to bring in this other aspect of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is another layer. It's very difficult, as you know, for women in many parts of the world to continue to get higher education. It's very difficult for women to have access to travel. It's very difficult in some countries for women to actually leave their homes without being accompanied by a man. And so for lesbians who are, first of all, many lesbians that we hear from have been forced into marriage. Gay men as well, but for women have been forced into marriage because this is what their culture and their country requires. And for a lesbian, you're adding not only the lack of choice, but also going against the integrity of her person. And so it's difficult for women to access the immigration policy and the refugee policy. And Lobat has talked about some of the issues that are currently alive and will clearly affect lesbians and gay men in terms of looking at the safe third country, and that they're not able to get status in the United States. Many of the people we see come from the Middle East, not only, but many do. We know for sure that they're not going to get status in the United States, and therefore Canada introducing this legislation adds one more burden to people who are already burdened and who are already challenged. I'm going to tell a story as well. Sure, that's okay, I can have it here. Primarily, I'm going to tell this story in the words of one of the women that I've been communicating with, because unfortunately, she's not able to be here to be able to speak her own truth. And so this is an email that I received recently. When my husband caught me, he had hidden in the house and was recording us. He took me in the bedroom, putting masking tape on my mouth, tied me up, and locked me there for 15 hours, from 10 a.m. to 1 a.m., then went with my partner. That was the last day I saw her. I heard his vehicle back at 5 p.m. with the kids from school. They did all they could, homework, bathing, eating supper, and slept. At 1 a.m., when the whole world was asleep, including our kids, he opened the bedroom, he undressed me, poured cold water on me, smeared salt on the whole body, then he beat me seriously. After, he lit a polyethylene bag and poured or dropped the hot liquid on my left hand 9 times and said, the 9 drops symbolized the 9 years we were married. To date, I have the scars. My cries could not be heard by anyone. When he finished, he removed the tape from my mouth, untied me. When I called my kids for help, the boys came and banged our bedroom door, crying, "Daddy, open." That was the first miracle I got. When he opened for the boys, I opened the window and called the neighbors for help. He couldn't do anything more to me because of the kids. The neighbors started knocking the gate. He sent the kids in their bedroom and went out to open the gate. I got some cash, slippers, and followed him to the gate. He opened and there were 4 people, our neighbors. One of them was a pastor. They asked him why I was calling for help, and he told them how he saw me kissing a woman. They all refused to believe him. Then he showed them the recording. Instantly, the 3 asked him to finish me off, to kill me. But the pastor asked them not. They were still arguing about my death, that I ran out, and he did not follow me. So then the next thing, of course, is she went to the police station and did not get any support from the police station because A, she was a lesbian, B, she was leaving her husband, C, she had 3 kids, and how could she be a lesbian and have 3 kids and have been married? But we all know that marriage was forced on her, that she had no choice. And so she, eventually, she was able to leave the country with her children. And so when a person leaves their home country in order to be a refugee, because you can't be a refugee in your home country, you have to go to a neighboring country, which she did, a neighboring country, a host country that we call a host country, that is also not supportive and not helpful to LGBT folks. They then go to report to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, because they're the ones that screen and interview all folks who go to a country to ask for refugee status before they can be resettled in anywhere. So she went to UNHCR, and the last email that I got from her, which was maybe yesterday or the day before, said that I don't understand why I'm still waiting for an interview. All the people that were with me in the refugee camp, they have all had their interviews, and I haven't. And I think it's because I'm a woman and I have 3 children, and my claim is based on my sexual orientation. I have 2 quotes here. The male told me, this is at the UNHCR office, the male told me, "Why don't you get a man and get married and stop loving your fellow women?" But the females' insults were the most painful. And we all know that when we don't have solidarity among women, it hurts us even more. And we also know that women have been socialized, all of us have been socialized in the same patriarchal way. So the females' insults were the most painful. She told me, "Why did you produce 3 photocopies of yourself? Your children are not normal children. You don't deserve to be called a mother. You don't deserve to be worked on. Why didn't you abort the 3 pregnancies? What if they did something on my file?" So now we're trying to figure out how we, as Rainbow Refugee, are able to sponsor this woman and her children and bring her to live in Canada. And one of the challenges is that it's very, very difficult for women to bring children with them, because the beliefs that are instilled in our society that children need a father, even if the father is abusive, and this father was abusive, that he still has rights to custody of the children, and that it's very difficult for a woman to get resettlement into a country where she wants to bring her children with her. And Canada does not really assist in this process. Canada, despite the fact that we are signatories to the rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child, Canada does not do a whole lot to actually change the dynamic that exists in terms of the rights of children in relationship to their parents, particularly in relationship to their mother. So those are things that we struggle with. We're working now with 3 families, 2 single lesbian women who have children, facing exactly the same situation, and I'm sure that we'll have more as more women are able to access the internet and are able to reach out and get the information that they need, because access to information, as we know, is power, and women have less access to information and therefore less access to power. So struggling within the immigration legislation and refugee law, it presents us with many challenges, particularly as they relate to women, single women, women who cannot travel outside their country without a male companion. They are not able to get a visitor's visa to come to Canada because they have no money, they have no property, they usually don't have a business, and they can't leave the country. And so, for example, women, and I've been corresponding with women in Liberia and Saudi Arabia who are desperate, lesbians who are desperate to be able to leave those countries and who can't because they cannot get out of the situation they're in. And so we're currently working with the Immigration and Refugee and Citizenship Ministry to actually look for some kind of way that's internal, another pathway that can be accessed by women who need to be able to find a safe place. And Canada is perhaps the only nation in the world that specifically assists and supports LGBT people who want safety because of the persecution of sexual orientation and gender identity. I haven't said anything about the gender identity issue, but many of the issues that women face in general, M to F trans women experience equally with another barrier, another burden on top. So the stories are horrific. I know they're horrific. I know they're hard to hear. I know they're hard to listen to. They're hard to read. But what gives me the energy is that we can, one person at a time, make a difference. And that is the way that I believe we have to go. When Rainbow Refugee started, we could not bring people, LGBT folks, to Canada to a safe place. We now can do that. And I was in Toronto last weekend when the Minister of Immigration extended our contract so that we now have a 5-year commitment from the federal government to support the refugee process for LGBT people. So it's possible. I started one person trying to get my partner into Canada as a lesbian couple. And now we are in a situation where since 2011, we have assisted something like 180 LGBT folks to come to Canada. So one person can make a difference. I'm proof of that. So please remember that you can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be sitting with people who care and have been doing work for so long. So I am wondering if you have few questions. I know some people are waiting for this space, but maybe a couple of questions.
Hello? Okay, yeah, it works. Sorry, I pressed the button. I wanted to ask a question. Well, I have a question and a comment. So my question is around I think it's a bill around immigration, the C 31 or 38C, something around a burden to the system, and how it especially affects potential immigration of people who have disabilities. And so as the immigration system is set up now, people who have disabilities are considered health burdens to the system. And so I know that there was some talk that this would change, but I'm just wondering if you have any updates as to what kind of changes are actually happening or not. So that was my question. My comment is around, I just want to caution us when we're talking about LGBT from other countries to not make it seem, of course there's persecution, of course there is discrimination, but to not make it seem like in other countries that Canada is somehow always better than other countries, or that people who are of queer backgrounds cannot live in those other countries. I just really want to caution us to not make it seem like, that people from, people of color from different backgrounds are not able to live as queer people in their countries. Of course there's persecution. I'm not saying that that's not the case. And also I really want to caution us around the dynamics and the discourse that can happen when Canada is seeming like this anyway, I just want to caution us with pinkwashing. That's all.
I'd like to take just a moment to respond, because certainly that is something that we always try to be extremely careful of. What we do is we respond to people who reach out to us. And the reason they do is because oftentimes their life is in danger. And so while we want to be able to support queer organizations in their own countries, because we do believe that people have the right to live and love whoever they want to, and to stay in their own country. However, unfortunately, that is not always the case. And I think the other piece to put into that is that this is also the result of a longer time colonization, extreme religious practices and beliefs. No matter what, Christian churches have been just as persecutory of LGBT people as has Islam. So we look at those principles for sure, and there are numbers of people who decide to stay and fight in their own country, And then they get to a point where they know their life is in danger, and then they turn to us.
Thank you. Any other question?
Rosa, maybe I should, disability part, I can answer. I can try. I'll just try and address the question about the disability and Canada's immigration system and how it deals with people who are with disabilities. I think what you're talking about is there's, for a long time, our laws have said that if you pose an excessive demand on our healthcare system, like you're going to cost our healthcare system too much, and it's some kind of arbitrary number set by the government, then you would be inadmissible to Canada, and it makes it extremely difficult to be able to come in non-refugee cases. You're right that there was a lot of talk about how this is obviously on its face discriminatory against people with disabilities, and the government did talk a lot about changing it. They did increase the amount of money that would make it considered an excessive demand. They changed some of the way those cases are processed, but they didn't ultimately get rid of it. So it's still there, and it should, and I agree with you, and I think it needs to go, like so many other things. There has not been, despite a lot of talk, there has not been many changes to the immigration system, legislative changes to the way the immigration system operates. And now we're basically at the end of this government's mandate, and we haven't seen those changes. Thanks.
So, sorry for, I don't think we can go to the next question because people are waiting for this room, so I'm told that we don't have time. So, thanks for staying as long as you were able to stay. Maybe you can connect with the panel in person, and then we can answer your question. So, thank you very much for